Clyde Ransom wasn't the kind of man to pick a fight. He was the kind who liked his peace quiet. His whiskey aged and his car purring like a jungle cat under moonlight. For years, he'd stayed out of the politics of Canyon Ridge Estates, never once attending a meeting, filing a complaint, or even trimming his hedges the way the rules suggested. But that all changed the morning he opened his garage and found his Lamborghini drowned. He stared in silence at the yellow beast, his pride, the one he'd rebuilt by hand after retiring from aerospace engineering, water up to the wheel wells, scuff marks along the side, the unmistakable smell of mold seeping in already. But what really told the story was the broken pipe snaking from the edge of his wall. Rooted directly from the neighborhood's irrigation line, Clyde didn't shout, didn't swear, just stared, then walked back upstairs and sat at his kitchen table, sipping black coffee and watching a squirrel wrestle a walnut on the back fence. For the first time in a decade, something inside him stirred. Across the street, Tamara Gelbin, the HOA president, was out in her garden. Her freshly dyed hair glistened under a wide-brimmed hat. She waved politely. But Clyde didn't wave back. He knew exactly what she'd done a week before. Tamara had issued a final notice: remove all non-conforming automobiles from view. Clyde's car had been parked inside his garage, invisible from the street. But Tamara didn't care. She had always considered his property an eyesore, too flashy, too bold, too independent. That's not what Canyon Ridge was about. That evening, Clyde met his son, Travis, down by the old windmill, the one that marked the border between the main houses and the undeveloped land behind the subdivision. Still remember what I told you about the water lines? Clyde asked. Travis nodded. The old irrigation grid. You said our land sits on the master inlet. Clyde pulled a rusted lockbox from the weeds. We're sitting on the tap that feeds them all. Travis gave a low whistle. You thinking what I'm thinking? I'm thinking it's about time someone reminded the board they're not the only ones with power. Clyde replied. He hadn't touched the main valve in years. When he bought the lot, the seller had offloaded it with all mineral and water rights, never realizing it controlled 80% of the HOA's flow. Clyde had kept that knowledge to himself, figuring it'd never matter. Now, it did. Back at his home, Clyde dug through storage and found the original documents, land rights, surveys, and pipe maps older than the HOA itself. It was all still legal, still binding, still his. The next day, Tamara strutted down his driveway, her clipboard tucked under one arm. You got a lot of nerve ignoring our notices, Clyde, she said, lips tight. We've had to reroute irrigation and now we've got homeowners complaining. Is that why my garage flooded? He asked calmly. That runoff isn't our responsibility, she said, glancing sideways. Maybe if you'd followed the rules. I've got no problem following the rules, Clyde cut in. When they're not written by someone who can't read a plat map. Tamara blinked. Excuse me? You'll want to sit down for this. Tamara, you've been drawing water from land you don't own. There it was, the shift in her expression, slight, almost invisible, but Clyde saw it. The subtle panic of someone realizing they've stepped too far and poked something that doesn't bark, it bites. She tried to laugh it off, but her voice cracked. You're bluffing, maybe, he said, or maybe I'll show the documents to your board and let them decide. He didn't raise his voice, didn't throw threats, but he didn't need to. As Tamara stormed back down the driveway, Clyde called out, you'll want to fix that irrigation line. Would be a shame if the whole neighborhood ran dry over a misunderstanding. That night, while the rest of Canyon Ridge slept beneath gently humming ceiling fans and watered lawns, Clyde sat on his porch with a flashlight and a wrench, staring at the old valve gate. One twist, that's all it would take. He didn't turn it yet, but he wanted them to know the storm was coming, not with rain, but with silence. It started with pressure, not from the homeowners but from the pipes. 2 mornings after Clyde's garage had flooded, residents up and down the west slope of Canyon Ridge began noticing odd things. Water sprinklers misfiring, faucets sputtering, a few showers going cold mid-rinse. At first, folks blamed the city, but the city had no record of outages. Tamara sat in the HOA office tapping her pen against a lukewarm bottle of mineral water as angry emails poured in. The landscaping team reported brown patches on newly laid sod. Several pool pumps were struggling to maintain pressure. One homeowner even called in tears her koi pond was down to a puddle. Clyde, meanwhile, was on his back porch with a set of binoculars and a ledger. He had started cataloging who used the most water, meticulously tracking sprinkler cycles and hose activity. Every hour, every address, not for revenge, not yet, but to understand what kind of grip he truly had. His son, Travis, came by with an old laptop and a smirk. Wired a pressure sensor to the primary line. We can monitor usage down to the gallon. Now, Clyde nodded slowly, chewing the inside of his cheek. How hard would it be to automate the restriction? I mean gradual, not enough to alert the city. but enough to remind them who controls the faucet. Travis laughed. Throttle it like a drip for easy, so they did, not a full cutoff, just a squeeze. Enough to choke sprinkler systems and confuse smart thermostats. A little dance between suspicion and denial. Meanwhile, Tamara called an emergency HOA board session. She was flustered but hiding it well. Something's wrong with the city supply, she declared. I've submitted a maintenance claim and escalated it to the utilities office. A board member, Julian, who'd never liked Tamara's tone, asked, why does Clyde's yard still look pristine? She froze. Excuse me, I walked my dog by his place. His garden's green, hydrangeas blooming, he even has a little water feature still running. Tamara waved it off. Coincidence, probably got his own pump. But the board began to murmur. Clyde, however, wasn't done sending messages. Late that night, he printed a formal notice on thick ivory paper and tucked it into every HOA board member's mailbox. It read, as the legal holder of Canyon Ridge Water Channel Access Point Number 1, I hereby reserve my rights to modify, restrict, or reroute irrigation in accordance with deeded land privileges effective 1983. For cooperative discussions on long-term usage, I'm open to negotiation. See ransom. Tamara read it 3 times before folding it in half with shaking hands. Her next move was pure retaliation. The next morning, Clyde's mailbox was plastered with citations, weeds too high, trash bin placement, improper exterior lighting. All of it manufactured, all of it petty, but Clyde didn't respond. He just clipped the citations together, filed them in a folder marked ammunition, and made a single phone call to a retired county land surveyor named Nelson Brett. By noon, Nelson pulled up in a faded green pickup with equipment in the bed and stories to spare. The man had helped map the original Canyon Ridge lands before the HOA ever existed. He remembered every trench, every line, every access valve. You're telling me they don't know you own the inlet? Nelson chuckled. Boy, they're toast. Clyde walked Nelson to the valve house. The rusted box still stood where it always had, half swallowed by vines and caked in time. Nelson photographed it, measured it, and nodded in approval. Still yours, still binding. I'll write up the affidavit and seal it, back at home. Clyde typed a new letter. This one wasn't as polite. If my property is harassed again, or falsified notices continue, I will begin restricting water by zone, with priority given to households not represented by the current board. You may consider this my final warning. He didn't sign it with flair, just his name, simple, firm. Then, with a small smile, he took a walk, up one side of the neighborhood, down the other, watching brown grass creep where green once ruled, watching worry settle in across the perfect symmetry of HOA-controlled lawns. He wasn't looking for conflict, but they'd brought it to his door. Now, it was his turn. By the end of the week, Canyon Ridge felt like a pressure cooker. Sprinklers coughed out air, lawns dried in broad daylight, and the normally pristine cul-de-sac had a faint scent of desperation wafting through its hedgerows. But Tamara Gelbin wasn't one to admit defeat. Instead, she doubled down. This neighborhood needs a morale boost, she told the HOA board, tapping her red nails against the conference table. We're going ahead with the summer pool party. Full staff, catered, residents need to see. We're in control. Not everyone agreed, but nobody dared challenge her out loud. Not yet. Flyers were sent out. Balloons were ordered. DJ Mike from downtown was booked. Tamara arranged for fresh deliveries of ice and water bottles paid out of HOA emergency funds. The board would throw a party so perfect that no one would remember the dying lawns or the silent faucets. At least, that was the plan. Across the street, Clyde stood at his second-floor window, sipping iced tea while watching a bounce house inflate behind the HOA clubhouse. He didn't react, but that night, when the neighborhood lights dimmed and most were asleep, he and Travis returned to the valve. Travis crouched beside the pressure sensor. Want to turn the tap fully off? No, Clyde said, not yet. Just enough to ruin the timing system on their automated fill lines. Let gravity do the rest. You're really gonna let their pool pump choke mid-party? I'm not letting anything happen, Clyde said, tightening the valve by half a notch. I'm just stepping aside. The next morning, residents poured into the HOA center in swimsuits and sunglasses. Kids ran toward the splash pad. Music thumped from the rented speakers. Tamara greeted every guest like a senator shaking hands on campaign day. But behind the scenes, things were already unraveling. The pool pump technician hired just the night before pulled Tamara aside. Pressure's way off, he said, squinting at a reading. We're barely recirculating. If this keeps up, chlorine levels will spike. Fix it, she snapped. Can't fix what's not there. An hour later, the splash pad dried up. The fountains began dribbling like old faucets, and the pool, it started turning. Clyde arrived just before the first parent noticed the smell. He stood on the edge of the party, dressed in khakis and a plain shirt, Watching kids toss water balloons filled with bottled water someone had brought in panic. He waved at Julian, the board member who'd once asked why Clyde's yard stayed green. Julian waved back, only this time with a different look, one of recognition. At the refreshments table, a crowd formed around a cooler full of melting ice. People were whispering, questioning, looking around. By the time Tamara stepped onto the microphone platform to announce the HOA raffle, a child screamed from the shallow and his eyes red. His face blotchy, chlorine imbalance. To more adults pulled their kids from the water, then another, then 10. Everyone, please remain calm. Tamara called out, voice cracking under pressure. Clyde turned and walked away. As he did, he overheard a man mutter, someone better call the city. There's something wrong with the water again. But Clyde had already checked. The city supply was fine. It was only this neighborhood, only this loop, only the homes downstream from the valve he owned. By nightfall, the HOA party was being called a disaster. Online neighborhood forums lit up with speculation. A few blamed old pipes, one posted pictures of the pool's strange tint and tagged the HOA's official page. Tamara spent the evening writing responses, but nothing she said stopped the questions. And for the first time, her board didn't jump to defend her. At home, Clyde flipped through the messages he'd received from neighbors over the past few days. One asked if he knew anything about the water issue, another asked if he could recommend a good well service. One more anonymously simply said, they shouldn't have touched your car. He didn't reply to any of them. Instead, he walked out to the shed and opened a long sealed toolbox. Inside was a set of irrigation blueprints, a valve key, and a signed permit from 1983. Everything he needed for the next phase. Tamara had always believed into things, authority and presentation. If she couldn't control Clyde through embarrassment or warnings, she'd use the legal route and do it in full view of the neighborhood. The morning after the failed pool party, a certified envelope arrived at Clyde Ransom's doorstep. Inside was a cease and desist letter from the HOA's new law firm, stacked with words like reckless endangerment, unauthorized disruption of utilities, and intent to seek damages. Clyde didn't flinch. He read it once, then again, slower, letting the words wash over him like bad jazz. Travis leaned over his shoulder. They actually think this will scare you? They think lawyers are bigger than deeds, Clyde replied. They've forgotten what came first. He turned to the file drawer in his study and retrieved a manila folder dusted from decades of silence. Inside were copies of the original land use rights, maps, and the notarized 1983 water access agreement signed by the county and the original developer. 2 years before the HOA ever existed, still valid, still his. What Tamara didn't realize was that Clyde had already prepared his next move weeks ago with the help of Nelson Brett, the retired surveyor. He'd submitted a preemptive petition to the municipal court, requesting clarification on long-held water rights. The hearing date had already been approved, but that wasn't the part Clyde cared about. He wanted Tamara to panic first. Across the street, Tamara was assembling the board for another emergency meeting. She stood in front of the projector, pointing at bullet points on a PowerPoint she'd titled Restoring Order. We've served him, now we wait. If he doesn't back off, we sue. But the board didn't respond the way they used to. Julian leaned forward, arms folded. What if he's telling the truth about the water lines, the deed? He's bluffing, Tamara snapped. We can't afford to blink. Another board member, Marissa, cleared her throat. Actually, he may not be bluffing. I asked my husband to look up the original county plats. Clyde's name is listed on the inlet channel. Tamara's face dropped, but only for a second. He's exploiting a loophole. That's all. The room fell quiet. Later that night, Clyde made his move. He wrote a short letter addressed not to Tamara or the board but to the homeowners themselves. He posted copies on the community board, slipped them into mailboxes, and taped them discreetly on pool gates and trash enclosures. Dear neighbors, you may be experiencing water irregularities. For clarification, the primary water channel feeding our homes passes through my land and is controlled under a legal, decades-old agreement that predates the HOA. I do not wish to disrupt the community, but the recent damage to my property and retaliatory notices have forced my hand. This is not about power, it's about respect. I ask for a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a reversal of all false citations, and a formal apology from the board. Otherwise, I will proceed with a full-scale redirection of the water line until a court ruling is delivered. I hope it doesn't come to that. Clyde. The response was instant. By morning, the neighborhood was split. Half supported Clyde, posting messages online with screenshots of the old maps and praising him for standing his ground. The other half, mostly close friends of Tamara, accused him of extortion. Tamara's phone buzzed endlessly, emails, calls, a knock at the door from the local news station. One reporter held a mic. While the camera rolled, is it true your HOA is being threatened with a water cutoff by a private citizen? Tamara forced a smile. We're handling it internally, but the clip aired that evening. The story was simple and explosive. Retired engineer controls key irrigation valve, HOA fights back. The thumbnail showed Tamara mid-blink and Clyde from across the street, arms folded, looking calm. It went viral by morning. Back in his kitchen, Clyde turned off the TV, poured a black coffee, and stepped onto his porch. For a moment, the neighborhood was still, then a car pulled up, a familiar one. Julian stepped out. Carrying a folder. Board wants to talk, he said. Clyde raised an eyebrow. As neighbors or lawyers? Julian didn't answer, but his silence said enough. The neighborhood was restless, water pressure had dropped again. And the online forum was now a mix of angry emojis, blurry lawn photos, and one brave soul who uploaded a meme of Clyde in a crown. The comments had turned against the HOA and Tamara Gelbin. She was unraveling. That Friday night, under the dim porch lights of the HOA office, Tamara paced with her phone to her ear. We've tried it your way, she hissed. The cease and desist did nothing. The residents are blaming me. And this man is turning into a local legend, a voice crackled back. Her cousin, Matt, who ran a landscape company with 2 trucks and a habit of skirting rules. I'll handle it, he said. Text me the location. I'll send the crew after midnight. Quiet, quick. Tamara hesitated, but only for a moment. Make sure no one sees you. What she didn't know was that Clyde had already seen it coming. He wasn't a man who relied on hope. After Tamara's cease and desist letter, Clyde had installed 5 new motion sensors along the rear fence near the valve shed. He updated his camera system and set an alert on his phone that pinged if anyone crossed the south line between midnight and sunrise. Just after 2:17 a.m. That alert buzzed. Clyde sat up in bed, already dressed. Travis met him at the window, eyes wide. 2 men, flashlights, clipping the lock, down by the shed. Matt and his helper crept through the brush. One of them held bolt cutters. The other had a small toolbox. They moved fast until the motion sensor's red light blinked once. Then came the sound they weren't expecting, a loud click followed by a booming voice from a hidden speaker. You are trespassing on private land. This action is being recorded. Authorities have been notified. Both men froze. Then came a spray of flashing lights, red, white, blue, fired from automated strobe alarms mounted to the tree line. It wasn't the cops, but it looked close enough. Matt dropped the cutters and ran. The next morning, Clyde emailed the board. No rants, no threats, just 5 crystal clear photos of the intruders, 2 high-definition video clips, and a time-stamped police report filed with the county. Attached to the email was a note. If your team returns uninvited, I won't be warning. Next time, I'll be pressing charges publicly. The board didn't respond immediately, but Clyde didn't need them to. By noon, the photos had already surfaced on the neighborhood group chat. Someone posted a zoomed-in shot of Matt's company truck idling just past the back gate. Another neighbor commented, so this is how the HOA fixes things now. Tamara tried to downplay it, claimed the men were there for routine pipe checks, but the footage said otherwise. No clipboard, no uniform, no company ID, just gloves, a toolbox, and panic. And then came the call that broke her. Julian, the only board member who still occasionally defended her, asked to meet in person. Tamara arrived at the clubhouse to find the rest of the board already waiting. Julian spoke plainly. We've seen the footage. We're exposed. Tamara started to argue, but Marissa cut her off. You're making us liable. We're removing you as president, effective immediately. You can't do that, Tamara shouted. I built this neighborhood, Julian nodded, and now you're tearing it apart. For the first time in years, Tamara didn't have a response. She turned, walked out of the clubhouse, and didn't look back. Across the street, Clyde stood on his porch, watching everything unfold. He hadn't smiled in weeks. But as Tamara's SUV sped off, leaving behind a swirl of dust and deflated pride, the corner of his mouth curled. That night, he received a message not from the HOA, but from a neighbor named Evelyn. Her backyard faced the dried-out trail behind the clubhouse. You were right to fight back. We should have stood up sooner. If you ever decide to turn off the water completely, just know you won't be alone. Clyde didn't reply, but he did walk out to the valve shed. He opened the old steel box, ran his hand across the cold brass lever, and stood there still and calm, as if weighing something heavier than water. He didn't turn it. Not yet, but the decision was getting closer. The valve turned just 20 degrees. That was all it took, not a full cutoff. Clyde wasn't looking to starve the neighborhood, just to sort out who had listened and who hadn't. From that point forward, the water trickled only to specific addresses, and every one of them had something in common. Their owners had either stayed neutral or sent a quiet word of support. Every other lot, the pressure dropped to a crawl. By the second day, the dividing line was visible from the sky. Patches of green stood in sharp contrast to brittle yellow grass next door. Hedges on one property remained lush while the neighbors withered under the July sun. In a subdivision that prided itself on uniform perfection, the imbalance was loud. Clyde didn't need to say a word. His quiet calibration had done more than any speech could. One neighbor, Marge from Elm Row, approached Clyde at the corner. "Mailbox, you giving us water now based on loyalty?" she asked. Clyde glanced over his glasses. "I'm distributing it based on cooperation," Marge huffed. "Sounds like blackmail." "No, ma'am. It's courtesy," he replied. "Which is more than I got when they drowned my garage and killed a car I built with my own hands." She didn't reply, just turned and walked off, slower than she arrived. Meanwhile, the interim HOA board scrambled. With Tamara out, Julian had stepped in as acting president, but leadership didn't come easily to him. The inbox overflowed with complaints. Some homeowners threatened legal action against the board, this time for negligence. Clyde's email arrived just as Julian was about to head home. It contained a PDF with digital readings from Travis's pressure sensors, a spreadsheet of water usage over the past month, and a detailed explanation of how Clyde had rerouted flow using underground switch points. The HOA never bothered to chart. At the end was a short, polite message: "We can settle this with civility and truth, or keep dancing. I'm still patient. See ransom." Julian sat back in his chair, blinking at the screen. It was like being handed a blueprint for surrender. The next day, Clyde went further. He installed individual digital meters on 3 main feeders and erected a small sign on his front fence: "Water access requires written agreement. Contact C ransom for permits." Neighbors began knocking. Some came angry, others came humble. One even brought a pie. "I'm not looking to stir the pot," Clyde told each visitor. "But I'm not about to keep letting folks walk all over me either." Those who respected the line, those who asked, got full pressure restored. Not through threats, but through acknowledgement. Others, still dried up by the week's end. The whole block was whispering. Some held quiet gatherings in their driveways, discussing Clyde like a folktale, half villain, half vigilante. Kids rode past his house slower than usual. One teen even dared to shout, "King of the water," before speeding off on a bike. Clyde didn't mind. That Friday, Julian requested a formal sit-down. Clyde agreed. They met at the local diner just outside the HOA boundaries. No lawyers, no forms. Just coffee and a salt shaker between them. "We need stability," Julian said. "Half the board wants to negotiate, the other half's too scared to speak. You've got us in a chokehold, Clyde." Clyde nodded, stirring his drink. "I'm not asking for money, I'm asking for acknowledgement, a public one." Julian sighed. "An apology?" "No," Clyde said. "A correction." Julian tapped the table, then looked up. "You win." But Clyde shook his head. "Nobody wins in a place like this. Either we fix the roots or we tear the tree down." Back in the neighborhood, changes began quietly. The HOA issued a newsletter stating that past enforcement actions were under review and adjustments would be made. The wording was stiff, but it was a start. Some neighbors celebrated. Others stewed, but one man wasn't done. That night, Clyde returned to the valve. He stared at it under the moonlight, listening to the hum of summer cicadas beside him. Travis asked, "You think they'll honor it this time?" Clyde didn't answer right away. He slowly turned the valve back to its original setting, full flow. Every pipe, every yard, every faucet roared back to life across Canyon Ridge. Then he locked the box with a heavy chain, double-latched, and sealed it tight. "They've got one more chance," he said. Then he walked away. The ceasefire didn't last long. Barely a week after Clyde reopened the valve and restored full flow, a new envelope arrived at his doorstep. This time, it wasn't from the HOA but from the county civil court. Inside was a summons. The HOA board, under pressure from a small but loud faction of residents, had filed for an emergency injunction. Their claim: that Clyde was misusing critical infrastructure, interfering with essential services, and endangering the structural equity of the neighborhood. Travis read through the papers twice and whistled. "They're going for the big guns now." Clyde didn't flinch. "Let 'em try. Their foundation's cracked, and this trial's gonna show it." Meanwhile, back in the HOA office, the board wasn't as united as the court filing made it seem. Julian sat with Marissa and 2 other members in a private meeting without Tamara, and without the ones who pushed the legal action. "I didn't sign off on this," Marissa said. "We were close to peace. Now they've dragged us into court?" Julian ran a hand down his face. "It wasn't a vote. It was Russell and Sheila acting through a subcommittee clause, which hasn't been used in 10 years, someone muttered. Word of the lawsuit spread fast, and not the way the aggressive board members hoped. Residents who once stood neutral started questioning things. Why had they sued the man who fixed the water? What would the lawsuit cost? And most of all, what was the HOA hiding? That's when Evelyn, the quiet neighbor who once emailed Clyde, dropped a bomb. She posted an anonymous file to the community forum titled HOA Financial Activity. Last 5 years, sourced from public records. Inside were scanned invoices, expense ledgers, and contracts, some real, others suspiciously inflated. One particular payment stood out, a landscaping job billed twice. Paid through a company registered under Matt Gelbin, Tamara's cousin. The same man caught on Clyde's cameras breaking into the valve shed. Residents exploded. I thought that guy was banned from working in HOA zones. Tamara signed that payment personally. So they flooded Clyde's garage, then sued him when he pushed back? The board tried to delete the thread, but it was too late. Screenshots flew. Someone shared the story with a local podcaster who focused on shady HOA letters. Within a day, the story had thousands of listeners. At his kitchen table, Clyde sipped coffee and quietly prepped his court documents. Travis handled the exhibits, maps, deeds, the 1983 water rights agreement, and most damning of all, the footage of the break-in with timestamps. And Clyde's police report. You think they'll try to settle before the hearing? Travis asked. No, Clyde said. They'll double down. People like this don't back off, they get louder. The court date came fast. Clyde wore a plain suit. No lawyer, just documents and clarity. Across the aisle, the HOA had 2 attorneys and a stack of binders. Their lead argument was simple. Clyde's control of the valve was irresponsible and unaccountable to the community. Clyde calmly laid out the facts. He didn't interrupt, didn't raise his voice, just submitted proof. When the judge asked about the 1983 agreement, Clyde handed over the notarized copy along with a statement from Nelson Brett, the retired surveyor who helped install the original lines. Then came the footage, the break-in, the bolt cutters, the motion sensor, the warning voice, the truck. Clyde played it all, and the courtroom went still. The judge leaned back. This doesn't look like responsible community leadership, he said, glancing at the HOA's attorney. It looks like intimidation. The opposing counsel fumbled. Your Honor, that act was not sanctioned by the board. Then who did sanction it? No answer. By the time court adjourned, the judge hadn't ruled yet, but everyone in that room knew which direction the wind was blowing. Outside the courthouse, Clyde didn't speak to the reporters waiting near the steps. He just tipped his hat and walked to his truck. That night, the HOA meeting was scheduled at the clubhouse, but only 3 board members showed up. The rest resigned quietly by email. And Tamara? She was nowhere to be seen. 3 days passed in silence. No lawnmowers hummed, no sprinklers clicked. Just the whisper of breeze across Canyon Ridge, where residents waited for the court's decision as if it were a final report card for the entire community. Clyde didn't wait. He kept to his routines: coffee at sunrise, walk through his garden, ledger entries at dusk. But even Travis could tell something was shifting. You nervous? He asked, watching his father jot irrigation notes in his worn notebook. No, Clyde said. I already did the hard part. At exactly 9:03 a.m. on Thursday, the verdict came in. Clyde Ransom retained full legal rights to the irrigation valve and the land it sat on, but there was more. The court acknowledged that while the HOA had authority to manage neighborhood systems, they had failed to account for pre-existing easements and privately deeded infrastructure. Furthermore, the judge issued a public warning. HOA governance is not immunity from responsibility. The order also required the HOA to reimburse Clyde for the damage to his property, including his flooded Lamborghini, and pay a penalty for unlawful interference with private utilities. And the court emphasized one key point: any future HOA action involving shared resources had to include Clyde's written approval. Back in Canyon Ridge, it was like a switch flipped. Those who had once scoffed at Clyde now waved when he passed. His mailbox overflowed not with warnings, but with thank you notes. One was from Julian, who had formally resigned the board the night before. We failed to lead. You didn't. Sorry, it took a mess to prove it. J. But Clyde wasn't gloating. That wasn't his style. In fact, what he did next surprised everyone. At the next HOA meeting, now held outdoors due to low attendance, Clyde showed up with a folded sheet of paper and a simple message. I'm not here to lecture you, he said, but I'm offering something. He proposed a new community agreement, voluntary, not enforced by fines or citations, a neighbor's accord. He called it, one based on shared respect, not legal intimidation. Under it, the water would remain open to all. Clyde wouldn't throttle, monitor, or meter anyone. But if the HOA ever tried another enforcement stunt without transparency, the valve would close for good. Most residents agreed, some didn't. A few still whispered about control and manipulation. But when the vote went around, the community overwhelmingly approved Clyde's proposal, and with that, a neighborhood that once revolved around trimmed grass and pastel fences took its first step toward real peace. Weeks passed. The grass grew green again on both sides of every hedge. The HOA shrank to a 3-person committee, now focused on things like potholes and dog waste bags instead of lawn violations. Clyde's name started showing up at barbecues, in group chats, and even in a local paper article titled, "The Man Who Owned the Water." But there was still one thing left to handle. One morning, a covered trailer rolled up to Clyde's house. Travis stepped out, grinning. "You ready?" he asked. Clyde nodded and opened the trailer latch. Inside, resting like a sleeping beast, was the same yellow Lamborghini, fully restored, down to the last stitch of leather and curve of polished chrome. It wasn't just a car, it was a symbol. Of what they'd tried to wreck, and what he'd rebuilt better. As Clyde sat behind the wheel and turned the key, the engine roared to life, low and smooth. He backed it down the driveway as a few neighbors peeked from their windows, smiling, watching history roll by. Later that evening, Clyde stood at the valve one last time. He unlocked it, oiled the hinges, and installed a fresh label, "Property of Ransom Water Access Trust, protected by law, reserved for the good of the community." Travis asked, "You trust them now?" Clyde looked down the slope of the neighborhood. The way the sunset glazed the rooftops golden, how the air finally felt. "Still, no," he said. "But I trust the land, and I trust that people don't change until they're made to." He locked the valve, not with chains, but with a smart latch linked to his phone. And with that, he walked back toward the house, the rebuilt car, and the porch where he'd once sat watching a squirrel with a walnut. This time, the neighborhood watched him. And for the first time in a long time, they weren't watching in judgment, they were watching in respect. Call to action for narrator. That's the end of Clyde's stand. But maybe just the beginning of a better neighborhood. If you enjoyed this story, share it, subscribe, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done if someone wrecked your car and thought they owned your water?